All right, class, if you had got this FRQ from this year's AP exam, I'm going to go over it, see if it helps anything, and I can use this for next year for my other students. So the first thing is they said, assume a country's economy is operating below full employment. So immediately think, recessionary gap, unemployment is going to be up right here. Draw a correctly labeled graph of aggregate demands, short-run supply, long-run supply, and label them as Y1, PL1, respectively. So I know below full employment, I'm going to need to draw a aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. Have to excuse that one. I didn't leave myself enough room to solve the next part. So make sure that we start over here in a recession, and eventually the question's going to have you move something over, so keep that in mind. Make sure you label PL1 and Y1 as your starting points right there, because that's what they tell you to do. And then you need real GDP, long-run supply, YF, and price level. Then they say identify one fiscal policy action. Remember, if I see fiscal policy, I'm thinking T or G that can take to restore full employment. So I know that's going to be an expansionary policy. So for part B, I want to say government spending would increase or taxes would decrease. Both those are expansionary, and they don't say explain, so that's really all you have to do right there. So part C, assume that no fiscal policy action is taken. Suppose there's a change in investment that causes GDP to go up by $200 billion. So investment is going up. So know that's part of Sig X, and that aggregate demand is going to go up at some point. Okay, so calculate the change in investment spending that could have caused this increase in real GDP if MPC is 0.25. Show your work. MPC equals to 0.25, and what I'm going to do now, MPS is 0.25, not MPC. Getting ahead of myself. Okay, so they're asking us calculate the minimum change in investment spending that could have caused this $200 billion. So I'm going to do a little bit of algebra right here. So I know that 1 over MPS equals to 1 over 0.25, and that gives me a multiplier of 4. So remember, this is our investment or government spending multiplier. So I'm doing a little algebra. What times 4, or how much investment times 4 would equal to 200 billion? Well, 50 times 4 is equal to 200. So it's going to take $50 billion change in investment spending to lead to that $200 billion in aggregate demand going up. All right, part D. Assume the output gap was initially $800 billion. So what that means is that you don't have to label the money, but I just did this to help me think of it. So I know that $800 billion was that gap from right here to right here. That's how much our shortfall of GDP was. And so what they're asking is, if we were short a recessionary gap of 800 billion on your graph in part A, show the short-run effect of the change in investment spending identified in part C, labeling the new equilibrium real output as Y2 and the new price level is PL2. So if I know right now if my gap is 800 billion and there's only 200 billion in aggregate demand created, we're not going to close the gap. We're not going to get back to equilibrium. So we are going to have an aggregate demand increase from 800. So we'll just add that 200 to it. Just in my mind, I wanted to write this out to show it. You didn't have to do that to get the point. But go from Y1 to Y2, showing that you had an increase in aggregate demand, but we still have an aggregate demand gap right here. And they didn't give us where we started from. So either way, as long as you left this gap open a little bit, saying we didn't reach back to full employment, you would have been good. Okay. All right. So part E, given your answer to part D, is the actual rate of unemployment greater than, less than, or equal to the natural rate of unemployment, and explain, of course. Well, right now we have unemployment, don't we? So if I remember that the natural rate and the actual rate are two different things. So I remember the natural rate, or remember UN is equal to, we're always going to have structural and frictional unemployment in our economy no matter what we do. Okay. Actual, though, is also going to include cyclical. Okay. So I know from part D that cyclical decreased, but not all the way to full employment. So actual is greater than natural since there is still cyclical unemployment remaining in the economy. That's the key. is anytime we have a recessionary gap, there's going to be a little bit of cyclical or that downturn in the economy left right here. Okay? So that's our answer. As long as you explained it somehow that there's still some cyclical remaining, you'd be good. All right, part F. Assume that private savings now increase. Immediately, you should be thinking savings, loanable funds. Okay? Supply of loanable funds. Draw a correctly labeled graph of loanable funds market and show the effect of the increase in private savings on the real interest rate. So I'm going to draw my demand and supply of loanable funds, show the loanable funds increasing to the right. Make sure you drop the real interest rate when we have more supply and demand remains the same. And that's what they ask you to do right there, is just draw the graph. Then G, based solely on the change in the real interest rate, what's going to happen to these things? Real GDP and long-run supply, explain. Point. Okay, now for part G, let's scoot this up a little bit. Part I right here of G and I, real GDP will increase in the short run because the lower real interest rate will lead to investment increasing. So I know that if investment increases, then that's part of Sig X, and that shifts aggregate demand to the right. So anytime we have low interest rates, remember, people are going to borrow, they're going to buy stuff. Okay? And usually when they borrow, they buy capital goods. So that leads us to part 2. Long-run supply will increase because the lower real interest rate will lead to investment increasing, and the capital increase. And therefore, the capital increases, which will lead to economic growth. Sorry about that. Okay, so that's the first question set on 2022, and hopefully that helps you see what will help you next year. My students for next year, but hopefully feel better about what you did on that test.